Welcome, I'm Nina Griffin, and this is the Astrology and Magic channel. Today we'll talk about my astrological forecast for June 2020. Patrons will receive this forecast almost 2 weeks before everyone else. If you would like to join my patrons and support future videos, as well as get exclusive access to content that's never made public, you can go to patreon.com/Nina Griffin. And thank you, patrons, for everything that you do to make these videos possible. So let's get started on June 2020. It's going to be quite an eventful month, astrologically speaking. The theme this month is Waiting in the Wings. I chose this title because the second half of the year astrologically is going to be quite active. We're going to have that 8-month-long Mars-Saturn square, and that really starts to fall into place in June. And then on top of that, we are going to see some interesting eclipses toward the end of the year. Finally, of course, in December, we'll see Jupiter conjoin Saturn in Aquarius, which is a major epoch-making conjunction that informs events and major developments in the world for many years to come. One of the reasons that the second half of the year will be so active is because Mars square Saturn will simultaneously aspect those degrees of Capricorn that had been activated in December, January, February, and March of 2020. So a lot of the events from those months that have been happening, that have sort of slowly been starting to peter out and fade away, are now going to get a second lease on life, for better or worse. So whatever we were dealing with in those earlier months, we are going to get a reprise and a very intense repeat performance, if you will, of some of those events. Now, this is one of the reasons that some astrologers say we are going to see a second or third wave of coronavirus or COVID-19 because Mars and Saturn will reactivate some of those very difficult configurations that created a global pandemic with COVID-19, but I'll get into that in a few minutes. The first week of June, if there is a theme to it, could be called Insistent Connections. And this is because on June 2nd, Venus will square Mars at 14 Gemini and 14 Pisces. Now, Venus and Mars are ordinarily very complementary planets. She represents the feminine principle, he represents the masculine principle. She represents the desire to connect, he represents severance and war. Even in mythology, the two of them have a very intense and passionate relationship. Now, when this aspect happens, we see a tension between the desire to connect and conflict. Because it's a square, we get a sort of uneasy truce between the two energies. And what can happen is sort of a compulsive desire to connect with other people, even when we have to make those connections via maybe violent or extreme activity in some ways. Now, in June 3rd, we're going to see the Sun conjoining Venus retrograde. This is the inferior conjunction at 13 degrees Gemini. These are the times that often bring revelation of scandal and base behavior in some way. The reason is that at her inferior conjunction, Venus is in perigee, meaning very close to the Earth. So on the one hand, she's very well positioned to impact events on Earth, but at the same time, she is also acting in a very lowest common denominator manner. And so this is one of the reasons that at this time, we often see revelations or exhibitions of very inappropriate and kind of low behavior in a Venusian sense, hence revelations of sexual scandal. Now, as Venus conjoins the Sun, she turns into an oriental planet that rises before the Sun. This is not always a comfortable position for Venus, and if you're interested in more about this, I encourage you to view my Venus in Gemini, Venus retrograde playlist on YouTube. Now, when she becomes Oriental, she asserts herself more. She is no longer the gentle, shy, retiring planet, but she is now more of a warrior and she has a mind of her own. So when she rises before the sun, she becomes much more in your face. In some ways, she almost takes on a more martial flavor, you might think. So therefore, this conjunction with the sun and Venus square Mars really want to socialize, and they want to be out in the world almost at any cost. They're willing to go to really extremes to have connections with others, to be out in the world. We certainly have seen this in, for example, protests that have to do with people not wanting to be locked down at home for health reasons. This, I think, is going to be an apex time for people's feelings of asserting their right to be with others, which is really Venus if you think about it. Now, interestingly, because Mars is involved here, there is potential here for violence and even bodily harm. So I want to be very, very clear about what that means. It could be that in this first week of June, there could be some danger. I think it's really important for all of you to, avoid areas where you could be harmed in some way. I think Venus with Mars, especially in a square and when she is conjunct the sun, can be very compulsive and not in any way reasonable. So this is a good opportunity to try to, keep yourself safe, keep yourself out of harm's way. Now, June 5th, we have a penumbral lunar eclipse at 15 Gemini, which squares Mars in Pisces. Now, a penumbral eclipse is the weakest eclipse of all. Some people say it's almost not an eclipse in any way. This is when the diffuse outer shadow of the Earth falls on the moon's face. If you think about the outer edge of a shadow, it's kind of half shadow, half not. It's just a gentle shade. So really these penumbral eclipses tend to act more as just full moons rather than full-on eclipses. And their effects tend to only last a few weeks instead of months, as is more common for lunar eclipses. So, however, I will say that this eclipse does impact Gemini, Sagittarius. And these are two signs that historically have been very active and very sensitive for the United States. So I do think that there is going to be some activity post this full moon / eclipse in the United States that we could see manifesting as aggression and disruption. And it could happen in a very public way, and it could happen at the very highest levels of our country. And the reason is that Mars is in the 10th sign from the sun, and it's simultaneously, of course, in the 4th sign from the moon. And so the idea of what is public and what is hidden, and then aggression and disruption being brought into this full moon are definitely going to be prominent for us. Now, June 6th, the next day, the sun will perfect its square to Mars at 16 Gemini. And so what this does is it really ties together the June 2nd Venus-Mars square, as well as the June 3rd Sun conjunct Venus. So really, it's this whole first week of June that, again, we're going to see these repeated themes of disruption, compulsive seeking for connections with others, and even potential violence and forcible behavior. Now, the second week of June is relatively quieter, and thank goodness for that after that intense introduction to the month. June 13th, we get a Mars conjunction with Neptune at 20 Pisces. I tend not to pay as much attention to outer planets. As my students know, I tend to view them more as icing on the cake, whereas the 7 visible classical planets are the cake itself. Now, what I think Neptune does here is it underscores an existing theme, which is this narrative of willful blindness to reality, willful blindness to kind of norms of behavior. And there's also this tendency to kind of sordid or illicitly pleasure-seeking behavior. So I think we're going to see some echoes of that even in the second week of June. The third week of June, I called The Players Assemble. And the idea is that the planets are now like actors that are waiting in the wings, which is the theme of June, just before the curtain rises on kind of that second part of the year. So June 17th, Mercury turns retrograde at 14 degrees Cancer. So this is when he revisits themes from January, February, and March, and that assembly of Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto in Capricorn. Because Mercury is stationing in Cancer, he's going to be opposing and kind of reactivating some of the same themes that we saw earlier this year. Because it's Mercury, this primarily has to do with narratives, with media telling stories about what is actually happening, sort of interpretation, if you will, as well as business and commerce. And so I think what we're going to see in the third week of June is a clear effort to reshape the narrative around the period, around the first quarter of this year, and to try to get back to business as usual. If you recall from my last May 2020 forecast, the concept of retrogradation always goes back to the past, right? It's a way to look back at what has happened and then either try to bring it back or try to change it and bring something from it into the future. So I think we'll see that with Mercury in June. Now, June 20th, Mars will sextile Jupiter, and they will be in a really nice mutual reception. So Mars is going to be in Pisces, which is the sign of Jupiter, and Jupiter is going to be in Capricorn, which is the exaltation of Mars. So I see this aspect as a very helpful and powerful opportunity to make a move to create something good. You know, it's a really nice proactive aspect and gives us an opportunity to kind of reevaluate how we are doing, particularly when it comes to the Jupiter in Capricorn values of doing more with less, of being frugal, of appreciating what we have, and getting back to basics, all of which are qualities that many of us have had to cultivate in the first part of this year. So with Mars sextile Jupiter, it's kind of a nice check-in that gives us an opportunity to see, is there something we can improve, and how are we doing overall on these important tasks? Now that same day, June 20th, is when the sun enters Cancer, which is the summer solstice here in the Northern Hemisphere. The summer solstice horoscope, or the Cancer ingress horoscope as it's called, shows trends for the upcoming season, in this case the summer, and it's based on your location. So you take that solstice horoscope and you set it for whatever country or area you wish to investigate for the next 3 months. In the US, we are going to see a challenging and disruptive influence when it comes to health and politics. And the reason for this is that Venus, who rules the first house of the people, will be retrograde in this chart, and she's going to be in the 8th house, which suggests loss and death. So I think there's going to be a lot of economic challenges, I think, around that time, and also a reevaluation of what this period has meant for us and what does that mean for us going forward. I will talk about this more in my monthly newsletter, by the way, which is free. If you'd like to subscribe, you can go to ninagriffin.com and just hit sign up for newsletter. It is only monthly, and I don't share your information with anyone, so you're welcome to sign up. On June 20th also will be the solar annular eclipse. An annular eclipse is when the shadow of the new moon is across or passes across what we see of the sun. And so because the new moon is much smaller, you do get that effect of a ring, a fiery ring around the sun, around the shadow of the eclipse. In Latin, a ring is annulus, so it's called an annular eclipse. Now, for those of you who are patrons at the $5 and $10 levels, this is discussed in a lot more depth in my Patreon video. For this forecast, though, I'll just mention that this eclipse is in Cancer. It's at 0 Cancer, and therefore it's going to be very powerful when it comes to impacting leadership. It has a lot of implications for kingship and who is running things. Now, this could be at the political level, but it can also be true in companies, in major economic, financial concerns. So be aware of that. The eclipse will be active for 2 years after this date, after June 20th, and it's going to be especially powerful in countries that are associated with the sign of Cancer, because that's where the eclipse is, as well as the places where the totality of the eclipse, or even a part of it, is visible. So this eclipse starts in Central Africa, it passes across the Arabian Peninsula, and then it goes into northern India and Kashmir, and from there it ends in East Asia. So these are all areas that will be impacted by the eclipse over the next couple of years. I also give more specificity about timing in my Patreon video. So these are all areas that could see effects from the eclipse. Generally, I think what we will see, in addition to the effects I just mentioned, the influence is going to be pretty challenging, I think, economically, because of Mercury's influence over the eclipse, as well as indicating excessive rainfall and flooding, which is perhaps less exotic, but it's something that's important to be aware of, because I do think that it will bring some pretty intense weather over the next couple of years. Now, the fourth week of June, I titled The Curtain Rises. So now the performance begins. So June 24th, Venus turns direct at 5 degrees Gemini. And it's a sense of maybe one's eyes are opened a little bit after a period of compulsion and blindness, as was symbolized through her retrograde period. So when a person has been ill and recovering, that's the kind of feeling that you get with a planet turning direct. It's not that the person is 100% yet, but things are on the right track. However, there tends to also be a sense of regret and perhaps opportunities not taken or opportunities missed at this time because of Venus's mutual separation from the Sun that has been occurring for the last several weeks since the conjunction. Now, what she does is, as she turns direct, she starts vainly pursuing the Sun. So there is this sense of, I missed my former opportunities, let me see if I can chase after them to catch them again. So there is a real sense of, again, regret and a sense of a life or a path not taken. Now, June 27th, Mars will enter Aries, and this is really the curtain-raising aspect here. As I mentioned, he will be in this sign for about 8 months through early 2021. So most notably, he will square Saturn for about 6 months. They're going to be an orb, more or less. What's less often mentioned, and I think just as important, is the fact that Mars square in the middle of the middle and late degrees of Capricorn, again, will reactivate a lot of those placements that we saw from the first quarter of this year. So again, many astrologers are concerned that this could be symbolic of COVID-19 returning, right? You have a sort of reactivation and a second life given to something that we thought was fading away. June 27th, we get an interesting foretaste of Mars square Saturn. So June 27th, Mars and Saturn will be in a sextile. So I think it's a sextile aspect, so it's friendly, it's easy. But I think those two planets being connected before they go into a full square later this year, around this time, we'll get a light foretaste of the rest of this year. So around Jupiter 27th and the days leading up to it, keep an eye out for what's going on in your life, what's going on in the news. I think it will give you a little bit of a hint as to what to expect later on. Now, the last week of June, the last few days, are going to be not to be omitted either, pretty major. So June 29th, we get our second Jupiter conjunction with Pluto, and this happens at 24 Capricorn. Now, this tends to be energizing for the stock market, up or down. It tends to reverse previous trends. That's been my experience, at least. And so after this, we have one more of these later in the year. But again, it does tend to be a kind of an intensifying aspect around money, around finance, around assets, all of those things. And so, of course, it does tend to impact what's going on in the stock market, and the kinds of people that invest in the stock market, or those large institutions, are often very impacted by this aspect. June 30th, we do get the Sun conjunct Mercury retrograde. So this is also an inferior conjunction. This is at 9 degrees Cancer. So just as with Venus, with Mercury, we also get more mundane manifestations of his energies. So because he is the planet of business, he's going to be, again, very focused on business, lying, interfering, obfuscating the truth. I think we're going to see a lot of that in a public arena. He does become a diurnal planet now because Mercury changes from diurnal to nocturnal based on his phase with the sun. So now that he is oriental, he will become diurnal. And what we're going to see, therefore, is a much more open behavior around mercurial issues. So business starts to open very dramatically now, and everything that was previously said quietly is now being said out loud and at full volume. So certainly the volume increases. This could have something to do with the US election cycle. As we, of course, here get closer and closer to the conventions of the summer and all that goes with that. Don't forget too, Mars is still in orb squaring the sun here. So I think we are going to get a lot of confrontational and untruthful speech at this time because that's what Mercury does. I think we're going to see some real fights in the media about what is true, what is not true. And again, we are going to see an intensification and again, almost a compulsion around business and around how do we accelerate money making, perhaps how do we make up for months of lost business that many companies have experienced earlier this year. All right, so this is it for my forecast. I hope that you enjoy it. Again, if you would like to get access to more exclusive content and certain content, get that early, such as this forecast, I encourage you to visit my Patreon. Thank you very much. I hope you subscribe to get future videos and talk to you soon.